I hope that Brian Green is proud of me for remembering that number. Okay. Ashrei Ashrei Veitecha Odi Elu Chasela Shem Shechalo Hashem Shadonai Elohav Tehillah David. Tehillat Adonai Yedaber Pi, V'yirach Kol Basar Shem Kashol Elam Vahed, V'anachnu Nevarchian, V'yatavid Elam Hallelujah, V'alat Zion, V'lashavish. ואתה קודש יושב תהילת ישראל, וקרא זה אל זה ואמר, קדוש קדוש קדוש, אדוני צבאות, מלוך על הארץ כבודו, מקלבי דמד. קדיש בשמר, ותישאני רוח, ושמע אחרי קורש גדול, ברוך כבראני ממקומו, נתני רוחש. ברכי קרא אדוני מתארש. אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד למחתה קיים אדוני צבאות עמנו, מתגלנו יעקב צלנו, צבאות אשר תמותך ואנחנו נשאיר לכם. ברוך אני שברך בבינו, ויפתח ליבנו בתורתו, וישם עלינו להוותו, וירצה לעשות עצמנו. ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה וידיר. We'll turn now to the Torah reading, or no Torah service. So if you have an Eitz Chaim in front of you, we're going to be on page 250. If you have just any regular Bible or Torah in front of you, we're in chapter 41 of Genesis, starting with verse 1. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. ויהי מקץ שנתיים ימים ופרעה חולם והנה עומד על היאור והנה מן היאור עולות 7 פרות יפות מראה בריאות בשר ותראינה באחו והנה 7 פרות אחרות עולות אחריהן מן היאור רעות מראה ודקות בשר ותמונה אצל הפרות על שפת היאור ותאכלנה הפרות רעות המראה ודקות בשר את 7 הפרות יפות המראה והבריאות ויקץ פרעה. Second Aliyah, verse 5. וישן ויחלום שנית והנה 7 שיבלים עולות בקניך בריאות וטובות והנה 7 שיבלים דקות ושטופות קדים צומחות אחריהן ותבלענה שיבלים הדקות את 7 השיבלים הבריאות והמלאות ויקץ פרעה והנה החלום והנה חלום. Okay, third Aliyah. ויהי בבוקר ותיפעם רוחו וישלח ויקרא את כל חרטומי מצרים וכל חכמיה ויספר פרעה להם את חלמו ואם פוטר אותם לפרעה וידבר שר המשקים את פרעה לאמור את חטאי אני מזכיר היום פרעה קצף על עבדיו ויתן אותי במשמר בית שר טבחים אותי ואת שר אופים ונחל מחלום בלילה אחד אני והוא איש כפתרון חלמו חלמנו ושם איתנו נער עברי אבן לצער טבחים ונספר לו ויפטר לנו את חלומותינו, איש כחולמו פטר. ויהי כאשר פטר לנו קרן היה, אותי השיב על קרני ואותו תלה, וישלח פרעה ויקרא את יוסף, ויריצו מן הבור, ויגלף וחלף שימותיו, ויבואו אל פרעה. So because we are not together in a minyan, we're going to go straight into the whispered Amidah, which can be found on page 223 in the Lev Shalem and page...
In the Sim Shalom, it's on page 573, and make inclusions, obviously, for Chanukah. In the Sim Shalom, it's right in the middle of the Amidah. In the Lev Shalom, it'll tell you to turn, I think, ahead to page 400 something, when you right in the middle of the Modim.
Yeah. הניסים ועל הפורקן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל המלחמות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. על הניסים ועל הפורקן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל המלחמות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. So because it's Hanukkah, we're not going to do the paragraph that we typically do at the end of the Amidah. We're going to go straight to Aleinu. So if you've sat down, please rise if you are able. We're on page 231 or page
598 in the Sim Shalom.
ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Kaddish Yatom, Mourner's Kaddish. Yit Gadal ve'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah. Be'amad Divrach Kirutei ve'amlich Malchutei. B'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala u'bizman kari ve'imru Amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam lomei almaya. Yit barach ve'yishtabach ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit ramam ve'yit naseh. V'yit hadar, v'yit aleh, v'yit halal, shemei dekudesha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen. So we timed this evening a little bit different than we normally do on a Shabbat afternoon. Normally Shabbat afternoon, we time it so that we have time for Mincha and then a text study class, usually in the Parsha, then Mariv and Abdallah. But because we're parlaying this service into a post-Shabbat text study on Hanukkah and then candlelighting and Havdalah, we only have actually a few minutes before we actually are going to daven Mariv and Havdalah. So I'll share a tiny Devar Torah. And then after we do Mariv, Rabbi Schatz and I will team teach together some texts that we've been thinking about throughout the week. So here's a little Dvar Torah that stems from a short but very meaningful, I think, psychologically astute comment by Rashi. Okay, whenever you use the word psychological with respect to the medieval commentators, it's an anachronism in the sense they didn't know the term or the field, but it doesn't mean they didn't know about human interaction and human behavior and human tendencies. As a way of getting into it, I want to explain to you one of the things that I tell the interns who work at Kimball Betham, and something we talk about as a staff as well, is the value in having a box, literally a box, where you place the notes and emails and cards and reminders that people send to you to express gratitude for something you've done for them. I have one literally in my office. I haven't actually been able to go there for a while. So now when something like that arrives, I keep it in a different place in my home and I'll join it with my box in the office. And there are notes in there from members of the community and from members beyond the community in response to something that I did. I helped them with some way of expressing their gratitude to me. And the reason I keep it there is a reminder that sometimes it's easy to forget how much we have in the bank. And in a moment where we're feeling self-doubt or feeling impoverished financially or otherwise, it can be helpful to dip into the bank and see actually how much is deposited. And sometimes, on hard days in life or in work, I open up that box and I find a treasure. And that treasure ends up being not only beneficial to me and my well-being in the moment, I think it's a kind of treasure that pays forward because it allows me to be more generous of spirit to others. When you feel filled up yourself, then there's no reason to respond to others other than to want them to be equally filled. Which is a way of saying that sometimes our emotional experience of what we have is more powerful and doesn't jive up with what we actually do and do not have. And to lack can be empirical, to not have something, and to lack can also be emotional and psychological. And to think that you lack is the same thing in your mind as lacking. You can convince yourself that you lack if you think that you lack. And if you think that you lack, you'll start feeling very differently about what others have. If you have, then you can applaud and celebrate what others have. If you think that you lack, it's going to be hard to see what others have and not begrudge it and not have envy for it. Put all that aside for a moment as we look at one phrase in the opening lines of Parshat Miketz. If you have it in front of you, Rabbi Schatz just read it, but it's from the 41st chapter of the book of Reshit. I guess I can call the page from Eitz Chaim as well. Starting on page 250. So as the parsha begins, as Rabbi Schatz read, with Pharaoh dreaming, and we all know the basics of the dream, but when you study Torah slowly and carefully, details come out and speak to you in a different way than when you're just laning them through. And there's nothing wrong with laning them through, but a slower pace has different wisdoms emerge. So look at the opening description of Pharaoh's dream. So he was dreaming that he stood on the banks of the Nile. Verse 2, from the Nile, Olot Sheva Parot. All of a sudden, 7 cows emerge. What kind of parot? Yefot mar'eh. Parot yefot mar'eh. Cows that were beautiful to look at. What does that mean? Rashi says, does it make sense that they were pretty? Like, can that possibly be an interesting enough detail? And what does a pretty cow look like anyway? And if by describing them as Yefot Mareh is a synonym for the next phrase that's going to come out, Uvriot Basar, full of flesh, meaning they were good looking and that they were healthy looking, well, when we're thinking of it midrashically, we don't allow for the Torah's redundancy, and therefore whatever Yefot Mareh means, it can't mean looking healthily filled with flesh. It's got to mean something different. And Rashi reasons that since his dream is a metaphor for the situation that his kingdom is in and is transferring into, and the kingdom went from being flush with resources to being in famine, what Rashi says on Yefot Mar'eh is as follows. Siman hu limei sova. This was an indication of plenty, of days of plenty. Shahabriot nirot yafot zolazo, such that creatures, not just the cows, this is analogized to the citizens of Egypt, that the citizens of Egypt really looked beautiful to one another. They could see one another's beauty. They could see one another's plenty and see it as beautiful. She'ein ayin biriyah tzara bechaverta. This represents a moment where there was no envy of what one person had because there was enough. And since there was enough, one didn't look at someone else's possessions as an indication of what you lack. Since there was enough, there was a shared sense of national and communal sufficiency. What Rashi is playing with is that it's hard to know which broke down first in this society. Did the amount of stuff that they had to eat break down first, and that allowed the society to break down in terms of how they treated one another? Or did what get broken first? Did what get ill first? Did what get sick first? Was that they started to feel that they lacked. And once they started to feel that they lacked, they didn't see the others around them, those cows, as it were, metaphorically, as Yefot Mar'eh, as beautiful in what they had, but rather they looked upon one another, looked askance upon one another with envy and a sense of jealousy. And that perhaps is what leads Egypt into a slide. What leads Egypt into a slide is not only that the Nile stopped producing the agriculture that it was supposed to, and not only that the animals that belonged to the Egyptians became thinner, but that the sense of mutual regard for one another and mutual responsibility broke down, and I started to sense that I lack. And once I start to sense that I lack, I want what you have. And if I want what you have, then I can't, then there's no enough for me to have, for me to be okay. So I think we all need to have versions of that box, whether physical or conceptual in our minds and our psychologies. There are certain moments, particularly for many different people in our society right now, where the lack is real, right? Where the cupboards are emptier and the bank accounts are smaller, and the things that we have that give us a sense of safety are just fewer. But I think it's also the case that there are many moments where we are forgetting the richnesses and the blessings that we do have, that will, if we remember them, will allow us to look more favorably and more generously on what the people next door to us have. And that will allow a sense of goodness to pervade from our home to the next and from the one after that, because we want to prevent the kind of decline that Egypt suffered. And some of that decline is empirical, and some of that decline is psychological and emotional. So create a bank of goodwill, a reminder of the blessings that you have in your life, and don't forget the code, so that when you can want to dip into it, you know how to access it. And don't be afraid to go there, to allow it to fill you up and to allow it to make your eyes yet more generous as you look out upon the world and see what others have, and remind yourself what you have as well. And a good Shabbos, and we'll go into Mariv, or actually almost now Shavua Tov. Rabbi Shatz will lead us in Mariv, and then we'll move into an extended teaching before we light candles and do Havdalah.
You want me to lead or do you want to lead?
I already Marived out, so why don't you?
Okay, I will lead. Great. Okay, we're on page 264 on the Lev Shalem. Again, this is the one page number I know, so we're on page 200 in the Siddur Sim Shalom, but then Rabbi Klickfeld will give us the rest as we continue on. והוא רחום יכפר עוון ולא ישחית והרבה להשיב פה ולרכו חמתו אדוני יושיע מלך יעננו ויום קוראנו ברוך אתה אדוני לנו החלום אשר ירום הרבבים וחוכמה בתי אשרים ותפילה משנה תמוך ומעביר יום ומביא לילה מבדיל בין יום ובין לילה אדוני צבאות שמו אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב ערבים אהבת עולם בית ישראל מחטאת ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל אל מלך נאמן שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד ואהבת אדוני אלוהיך למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים אלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם אלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת ואמונה כל זו קיים עלינו ומלכותו ברצו קיבלו עליהם משה בני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך בעלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורא תהילות עושה פלא מלכותך ראו בניך בוקר היום לפני משה זה אלי אנו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר כיבד אדוני תקל כולם ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל אשכיבנו אדוני לשלום ובנינו וחנו שלום וחבטכם בצד ושמור צאתנו ואוהינו לחיים ושלום תהווה עד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל לעד We'll turn now to the Whispered Amidah, page 270, in the Lev Shalem, page. Rabbi Klingfeld. Sorry, you're on duty for page number. Page something in the Siddur Sim Shalom.
For the Amidah in the Sim Shalom, it's on page 210. And again, make conclusions for the end of Shabbat and also for Chanukah.
Nerotalalu anu malikin, Nerotalalu anu malikin, Alanisim, Ve'alaniflat, Ve'alatashut, Ve'alabilchamot, She'asita lavotenu, She'asita lavotenu, Bayamim ahem, Bayamim ahem, Bayamim ahem, Bazman hazeh. In your Siddur, at least in the Lev Shalem Siddur, right at the bottom of the Chatzi Kaddish is a paragraph that begins with Vayi Noam, which is where we're going to pick up right now, and that's on page 279.
Page 682 in the Sim Shalom. .683, sorry.
יקראני בנעמי מונכי בצרח חלצי ובכבדהו אורחם עם אספי ורי ושועתי אורחם עם אספי ורי ושועתי. We'll turn now to Aleinu, page 281 in the Lev Shalem.
And in the Sim Shalom, page 609, 600 and, sorry, 696.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגוי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגור עלינו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא, שנות השמיים ויסד הארץ ומשה ודבר ושמש. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Runners Kaddish, page 282. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קרי ואמרו אמן, יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם לעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה ברכו, לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Amen. 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 Oma Shavua Tov, everyone. Hello, everybody. We're here on Zoom. We're live streaming as well on YouTube. Rabbi Schatz, is it possible if we're live streaming on YouTube, does that mean we cannot also live stream on Facebook? It's one or the other?
I believe so. I don't actually know.
Okay. Well, okay, we're live streaming on YouTube, but it'd be nice to live stream on Facebook also.
Were you planning on starting right now with the teaching?
Remind me, was that not the plan?
No, it's okay. It's just that we're running a little early, which
okay.
which is a Schatz Kligfeld trait. So we just
what time did people expect this part of the program to start?
5:25. It's just not actually Havdalah here yet. So do we want to sing a little? Do we want to give an intro? What do we want to do? We can do Zerot. That's a thing we do.
Let's sing a little bit, and then when it gets closer to 5:25, we can start the program. Because you think there are people who are joining after Shabbat just for the program. Got it.
Yeah, whether on here or on YouTube, there are people who will join after Havdalah.
Okay. What shall we sing?
I was hoping you would know. Well,
we can do Hanukkah songs.
We could, yeah. We haven't done Mao's Sur yet tonight. You could lead us in Mao's Sur while I find others.
Sure. Let's sing Mao's Sur, and then if we feel so moved, we can do so after lighting candles as well.
It's on page 429 in the Lev Shalem. If you want to look at the words, it's on the left margin. It's in a weird place.
And in the Sim Shalom, let's see.
This is also a great time for people if you wanted to get a little bit of nash, or if you wanted to get a l'chaim. It's the way that we suggested you come to this learning. So if you wanted to get up and take a little stretch and do those things, then you'll be right on time for the teaching in 4 minutes.
Mao's Sur is at the bottom of 242 in the Sim Shalom. Mao's Sur Yeshuati Lecha Na'em לשבח תיקון בית תפילתי ושם תודה נזבח לעת תכין מטבח מצור המנה ביח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח אז הניגון ירבעי הו ידעי 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 ay 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 anay day da da day ay anay ay ay anay nay 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 anay anay nay ho da da nay ay 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 day 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 ay ay day day yeah, yeah, ay, ay, baba, ya, da, da, ay, yeah, yo, ay, baba, ya, da, da, ay, ya, da, da. Rabbi Shas, do you know the words to Ocho Candelitas?
Not by heart, no.
Here, I'll put them in the chat.
There is no chat.
Oh, there's no chat? Why is there no chat? Can we make there be a chat?
It's the Zoom, no, because it's the Zoom we use for Shabbat, so there's no chat.
Not the chat.
You could share your screen.
I can share my screen. Look at that. Look at you coming up with solutions. Okay. If I share the screen, do you know this? Do you know the music? Hanukkah Linda está aquí. Ocho candelas para mí. Hanukkah Linda está aquí. Ocho candelas para mí. Oh, una candelica, dos candelicas, tres candelicas, cuatro candelicas, seis candelicas, siete candeliques, ocho candelas para mí. Yeah, that song has such an old feeling to it, but according to Wikipedia, and if Wikipedia says it's correct, it was composed in 1983. It seems like it has an older provenance on that, but I had no idea that it's just from the early 1980s. It feels like it comes from the old country of America in 1983.
I wonder if that's the same Jagoda as related to Ilana Jagoda, who's now a cantor in Northern California.
It could be.
Hmm.
Okay, so
it's been sung by Adina Menzel, so that's how you know that it's really made it.
Is that true? She has
Wikipedia said.
And also Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, apparently, Aaron Baron Cohen.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, Rabbi Schatz, one more song and then we'll jump into it.
Okay, it's 5:25. We could, but we can sing Nerli. Let's do that, and then we'll ease into it. Okay. Nerli, 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 dakik, b'Chanukah Nerli adlik, b'Chanukah Neri yair, b'Chanukah shirim ashir, b'Chanukah Neri yair, b'Chanukah shirim ashir. The first time I sang that song, I was 5 years old at a school assembly, and I still remember it. Okay.
So Rabbi Schatz, the order is we're going to do the teaching and then candlelighting? That's the order?
Yes.
Okay.
Havdalah and yeah.
So hi everyone, Shavua Tov, and hello to everyone who's watching on live stream. Rabbi Schatz and I wanted to do some tag team teaching with you. I'm going to share the screen for most of it because I don't think we handed out this text sheet in advance, and it's going to be helpful if you're actually looking at it.
We did, but it will be good for people to have it in front of them if they didn't get it from the bulletin.
Okay, so let me share that with everybody. Okay, so as a way of getting into this topic, I want you to think about the number of different ritual and cultural traditions you know of that celebrate some sort of a light festival during the darkest time of the year, right? So we are about to pass the winter solstice, the day when we have the least amount of light in the in the sky, and either everyone's national and religious holidays happen to match up just perfectly around the same week, or there's something deeper and primal about pulling light from darkness that somehow made its way into religious and cultural traditions that ended up overlapping with each other in people's consciousness, but really just stemmed from the same human urge. And there are actually hints of that possibility. It's not a certainty, but a possibility in parts of the Talmudic tradition, including parts of the Talmudic tradition. One second. Sorry. Let me just turn off my notifications. Including parts of the rabbinic tradition that are familiar to you in terms of setting up some of the basics of Hanukkah. So most of what we know about Hanukkah from the rabbis are on about a page and a half or 2 pages of Talmud in around Shabbat 20, 21, 22. Right? Masechet Shabbat, the tractate of Shabbat, which mostly deals with the laws of Shabbat, but the Talmud goes off in tangents, and it has a section referred to as My Hanukkah, which means what is this thing called Hanukkah? And we're going to begin reading, and some of this will be familiar to you, or at least the impact of these texts will be familiar to you, even if you haven't seen them in their original situation. So the Talmud says Tanu Rabbanan, which means we have a tradition from the era of the Mishnah, but which was not included in the Mishnah. So this is the rabbis writing in the 4th or 5th century CE, reminiscing about a text from the 1st or 2nd century CE from the era of the Tanaim, who wrote the Mishnah, but not actually included in the Mishnah. It means that there's nothing about Hanukkah in the Mishnah. The first core religious text that we have from the rabbis does not mention Hanukkah, but they wrote about it in that era. It just doesn't make its way into the tradition until the Talmud is codified. Mitzvat Chanukah, ner ish uveto. This might come as a surprise. The core mitzvah of Hanukkah is for one person to light a light in his or her house for all 8 days, right? So you could get away on Hanukkah with just having a single lamp or a single candle or a single thing of oil with a wick. And no matter what night of Hanukkah it is, according to the rabbis, that's the core obligation of Hanukkah. V'hamahadrin, those who really want to be lehader, to bring beauty to the mitzvah, those who want to make it a more special occasion, ner leil echad ve'echad, each night of Hanukkah you add for every person in the family gets their own, but still it's only one. If you really want to go to the highest high, but there's no obligation to do that, and I'll put in interesting parentheses, Hanukkah, it's interesting that it's the holiday observance observed by an extremely high percentage of people who consider themselves Jewish, even those who don't consider themselves to be religiously Jewish, but only secularly or culturally Jewish. And yet nearly every person's observance of Hanukkah is at the level of Mehadrin min Hamedrin, the highest level of the Talmud anticipated. And this is the culture that you know. Beit Shammai says, Yom Rishon Madlik Shmona, on the first day you light 8 in your Chanukiah, Mikan ve'elach pochet v'holech, and from there you continue to reduce by 1 each day. So on the 8th day you have 1. Beit Shammai would have had a very different looking Hanukkah house than us. Beit Hillel Omrim, and the house of Hillel says, and this is what we do, Yom Rishon Madlik Achat, on the first day you light 1, Mikan ve'elach mosif v'holech. And from that point forward, you continue to add one, right? So at the end of this section, you have the basic norm by which most Jews who observe Hanukkah anywhere in the world observe it. Every person, whatever Chanukiah you have, each day of Hanukkah, the light gets stronger and stronger. Now, built into the explanation for this, we have a window into a source for the length of the days of Hanukkah that have nothing to do necessarily with the beautiful story we all were taught when we were 5 years old about the oil lasting more than one day. Okay, so look at the next section. Amar Ula. Ula is a sage from the Amoraic era. So this is the era of the Talmud, 100 or so years after the Mishnah. Pligi ba tre Amorae b'ma'arava. Two Amoraim, two rabbis from that generation, disagreed with this from the West. What's the West mean? We normally think of the land of Israel being in the East, but if you're in Babylonia, which is where this is being written, the West is Palestine, Israel. So Ula says there were two Eretz Yisrael rabbis who disagreed. What did they disagree? They disagreed not about whether Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai said what they said. That was not in a disagreement. They disagreed as to what was the rationale for their proposed ritual. Why Beit Shammai said you start with 8 and go to 1, and why Beit Hillel says you start with 1 and go to 8. Some of this will be familiar. Rabbi Yossi bar Abi and Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. These are the two Israeli or Israel, land of Israel rabbis who had this disagreement. This is a common approach in the Talmud. We have a disagreement between two rabbis. We say one of them says this and one of them says that, but the Talmud doesn't ascribe who said which and who said what, just that one of them said each of them. One of them said, you want to know why Beit Shammai did his Chanukiah that way? Because he wanted the lights in the Chanukiah to represent the number of days you have left. Remember, as a child, I remember once you hit the 5th night of Hanukkah and you were halfway over, and it was depressing because you loved the fact that it was that you were going to be able to have the Hanukkah lights and the songs and the dreidel and the gifts all 8 days. And once you got halfway through, there was a sadness that you were approaching the end. Beit Shammai says that the Chanukiah should represent that reality that we start with a holiday full, and it's like a tank getting decreased in its capacity because the holiday is coming to an end. So the candle should represent the number of days in Hanukkah still yet to come. V'tama de Beit Hillel, according to whichever Amoraic rabbi this was, says no, well, not no, and the reason for Beit Hillel's wanting us to go from 1 to 8, keneged hayamim hayotzin, to represent the number of Hanukkah days that already have been, right? And that's why we end with a flourish, because we have now been through 8 days of Hanukkah, and our Chanukiah represents that. Most of us would probably at least identify with that explanation for Hillel's answer, right? That you're building up a sense of the number of Hanukkah days you have celebrated. But the other Amora said there's an entirely different reason explaining the 8 to 1 and the 1 to 8. Chad Amar Tama de Beit Shammai keneged parei hechag, which is in yellow because we're going to focus on that. One said, why does Beit Shammai go from 8 to 1? It has to do with the bulls of the holiday. To which your response is, what? Unless you're reading ahead or looking at the English. Like really, like what? Question mark, exclamation point. What bulls? What holiday? How is this at all a representation of a Chanukiah going from 8 to 1? Hold that thought. But Tama de Beit Hillel, and the rationale for Beit Hillel, de ma'alim b'kodesh ve'ein moredin, which is a beautiful semi-halachic, semi-kind of cultural concept in Judaism, that you're supposed to go up in holiness and not go down. And if your Chanukiah is decreasing in its intensity and its luminescence from 8 to 1, that would be representation of something going down. Rather, we want to build up the sense of light and beauty and joy in our life. We present all of this mostly to focus on those 2 yellow words. What is this understanding? That Beit Shammai's Chanukiah has something to do with Parei Hechag. Look at Steinsaltz, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, who wrote a classic and beautiful elucidation of the Talmud in Hebrew and in English. Look what he says. Do I have it in English here also?
No.
Sure. Okay, I'll just read. V'chadamar, one of them says, Kitama shel Beit Shammai hu keneged parei hachag. The rationale for Beit Shammai's decreasing Chanukiah, going from 8 to 1, has to do with the bulls of the holiday. Haparim, the bulls, shehi krivu, that they sacrificed, b'chag haSukkot, on the holiday of Sukkot. To which, again, your response is, what? Aren't we in Hanukkah? What does this even mean? That Beit Shammai's Fakakta Chanukiah has to do with the number of bulls that were sacrificed on Sukkot? If we look closely at the way the Torah describes in Parshat Pinchas the sacrifices on Sukkot, Shebeyom Harishon Hayu Makrivin Shlosha Asar Parim. On the first day of Sukkot, they would sacrifice 13 bulls. Uvachol Yom Hivchitu Par Echad. And every day, and you can look in the 29th chapter of Midbar and see it, they would reduce by one bull. And that's the explanation. Okay, so maybe that explains half of it or a third of it. It's true that on Sukkot, the number of sacrificed bulls every day is reduced, but it's not reduced from 8 to 1. And even more importantly, what is the connection between Sukkot and Hanukkah? The only thing I want to pin on that is that Sukkot is a holiday, particularly if you add Shmini Atzeret on the end, which is 8 days, and Hanukkah is a holiday that lasts 8 days, and maybe there's a stronger connection between those two than we thought. Rabbi Schatz?
So I have to give credit where credit is due. Rabbi Shapiro actually learned this text earlier last week and shared it with me. He was very excited to share it. And I had never heard this before. And when Rabbi Klickfeld and I were preparing for this class, this is exactly what we're talking about, that in the book of Maccabees, we don't have to read it. I mean, you can read it on your own if you want, but I'm going to explain what it says. In the book of Maccabees, it actually explains to us that as soon as the people were able to observe freely, that the first thing they did was they celebrated Sukkot, which, as Rabbi Klickfeld just mentioned, it's also 8 days. So it's possible that because they were celebrating Sukkot and then we decided to celebrate Chanukah based on what happened after the experience, I'll just call it, of Chanukah, that maybe that's where we got the 8 days, because they decided then to celebrate this Chag of Sukkot. And you'll see in the second verse on the page where it says Maccabees 10:10, they do all the things that we would expect them to do that we do on Sukkot, but they were doing it. I assume, maybe Rabbi Klickfeld, I don't assume that this was during the time of Sukkot, right? That this was just when they were able to celebrate. Is that true?
My understanding of the best guess of the history is that once the temple was rededicated and they had access to the ritual functions that they couldn't have when it was desecrated, they went back and did the most recent holiday they had missed. What's the most recent holiday they had missed? 7 days of Sukkot plus Shmini Atzeret equals 8. I see Alan's hand up. Alan, please, Vakasha. You say something?
That is exactly the case, because they were battling and they were otherwise weren't able to observe Sukkot. They made Hanukkah, when they were rededicating the temple, they observed it for the holiday of Sukkot that they couldn't do. Yeah. And also it's the 8 days that ties in from another way that I'm reading The Jewish Way by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and he noted that Solomon also had dedicated the temple in connection with Sukkot, and that dedication extended 8 days, as is understood from 1 Kings 8:66. So if that was their model of what was going on before, it would be consistent with having this model here of the dedication for 8 days of Sukkot and tying it into the Chag.
Good, right? And if you remember from Parshat Shmini, the notion of 8 days being a period of time of dedication and the inauguration of the first priestly class, it's very possible that there were reasons for 8 associated with Hanukkah, that a beautiful story of all oil was grafted onto, but may not have been the core reason for the original number of days. Joanna?
I'm finding such a contemporary relevance to this concept to the times that we're living in, because I've seen discussions in more traditional communities that won't get on Zoom on Shabbat about what are we going to do when we can gather again about all of the Torah readings that we've missed and we haven't done yet. So all of a sudden there's this whole, aspect of, broader than, this one specific instance of Sukkot being missed. But what do you do when you can't observe a mitzvah at its proper time?
Yeah. And the Torah has some provision for that with respect to Pesach. Pesach Sheni was described so that if you were impure or away when Pesach happened, and biblical Pesach was not a Seder, it was offering the sacrifice, you had an opportunity to do a redo. I remember when I was a rabbi in upstate New York for 9 years, a very hardy community, no matter what the weather, we would somehow find a way at least to get a minyan to show up to shul. There was one Shabbat where it was a blizzard. It was an utter blizzard. I lived in a house behind the synagogue. I kind of put on my snow clothes and my boots and came down to see if anyone showed up. There was one person who showed up, tried to get up the driveway. It was a very steep driveway in a Jeep, got halfway up, couldn't make it, and turned around and went home. So shul didn't happen. Right? I remember discussing that week with the leadership and the ritual committee. Well, what do we do this coming Shabbat? Did we I don't remember what Parsha was. Let's say it was Parshat, Shmot or something in the middle of winter. Does that mean that Congregation Eitz Chaim of Monroe just never got Parshat Shmot this year? What you're supposed to do technically, halachically, is that if a community in its entirety misses a davening, the next Shabbat, you're supposed to do a double Parsha. You're supposed to read that Parsha and the previous week's Parsha, which is what we did, because we figured this is a community that likes to come to shul and expects the Torah to be read. We read a full Kriya, and the following Shabbat, we did our own version of a double Parsha, like it's called Tashlumin. It's the same thing when you miss an Amidah. If you're someone who davens 3 times a day, and there are all sorts of elaborate halachot about this, if you miss the Amidah of Shacharit, then when you come to Mincha, you're supposed to say the Amidah twice, even if that feels silly. So the notion of these religious, and I feel like I should be giving this back to Rabbi Schacht in a second, but the notion of these religious activists and religious zealots saying the temple is back in our hands, what should we do with it? We should do the very thing that we wanted to do a few months ago, but we're unable to, namely Sukkot. Rabbi Schatz, do you have more on that? Or do you want me to go to the next source?
The only thing I was going to say about this that in putting Sukkot and Chanukah next to one another, especially based on the part from Masechet Shabbat that we just read about whether we should go up or go down in terms of numbers of candles, that when you think about a sukkah, the schach by the 8th day of Sukkot has dried out. It's withered away. And there is something sad about that, but it also, at least to me, signifies that, okay, now we're moving on to the next thing, that this home that we've created has done what it needs to do, and now we're moving on. Whereas with Chanukah, the way that we practice, according to Hillel, because we believe that the light should grow, there's almost a backwards association to Sukkot, that we are actually adding that light. And when we leave the holiday, we've sent even more of Hanukkah almost into the world. Then with Sukkot, we start off really strong and we end withered. And in fact, with Sukkot, we go into the next holiday immediately. And with Hanukkah, there's obviously a break until the next holiday. And in terms of our theme of bringing light into the darkness, I had never thought about this until you talked about how on the 5th day it feels sad that we really we allow ourselves to celebrate this holiday looking forward to what we can do with that light after the holiday has come to an end, rather than imagining that we have all of that energy, that we have all the light at the beginning and then it dwindles away, which somehow feels beautifully dissonant to Sukkot, but in a way that that still makes those two things connected.
So you might say that Beit Shammai's argument is a little more honest about what it feels like when the days of Hanukkah are getting towards the end, and it might be more based in the actual history of the circumstances. But as usual, Beit Shammai loses. The reason why we brought all of this up was really just to create a fissure, just to create a crack in the notion that we know for certain why the holiday is the number of days that it is. And through that fissure, through that crack, we're going to push a rather wide train, or rather not us, the Talmud itself. So in a different part of the Talmud altogether, Tractate Avodah Zarah, the tractate that deals with idolatry, is one of the only other places where there's even an obscure hint towards something having to do with Hanukkah, and it has to do with the discussion of their holidays, idolatrous holidays. So we have a Mishnah in this first chapter, Avodah Zarah. V'ilu idehen shel obdei kochavim. These are the names of the holidays of the idolaters, and you see in that word idehen, you might know that word in Latin, Ides, like the Ides of March, same word, right? These are their holidays. And they had names, Kalenda, and it's written out here in Hebrew as Saturnura. Most scholars would refer to this pagan holiday as Saturnalia, and Kratesis, and Yom Gnusia Shel Malkehem, which is some festival related to their kings, the Yom HaLeida, and the king's birthday, the Yom HaMita, and when the king died, it's like the joke about when you say Tachanun, you don't say Tachanun if a rabbi died, if a rabbi was born on that day, which means that there's never really a good excuse to say Tachanun, because there's always some rabbi's birthday or yurtzeit. Did Rabbi Meir, that's what Rabbi Meir says. The sages say, Kol mita sheyesh ba sreifa, any death of a pagan king that had some kind of a public immolation or burning, yesh ba abudat kochabim, that holiday brings along with it the imprimatur of idolatry. V'she'ein ba sreifa, if it doesn't come with a public burning, ein ba abudat kochabim, it might be a significant date of them. We don't have to think of it as one of their yontifs. Aval yom tiglachat zikano uvlorito v'yom shalabo min hayam. All these significant days in a king's maturation or growing, or when he was saved from the sea. V'yom she'yatzah mi beit ha'asurin, or a day that he was redeemed from prison. V'yoved kochavim she'asah mishteh livno eno os asur ella oto hayom bo'oto ha'ish bilbad. So if there's these individual days, then you as a Jew, your obligation to not, because what this is in relationship to is your prohibition from doing any commerce with an idolater in the days leading up to or after their yontif, because God forbid you should do commerce with an idolater. They should feel grateful for that commerce, and then they thank their gods for having done business with you, and you have been a partner to idolatry. Okay, that's the context. Now the Gemara, a couple of hundred years later, starts looking at one of these holidays very, very in a very focused way. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rabba. Rav Chanan bar Rabba said, Kalenda, one of those that we mentioned above, a holiday called Kalenda, maybe it has to do with calendar, I'm not sure. Chet Yamim Achar Tkufa is 8 days after Tkufa. Tkufa is a Hebrew word that means a period of time. The best way to think of this here is a solstice, and what this is referring to is the solstice of Tevet, or the solstice, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. Saturnalia chet yamim lifnei tkufa. And Saturnalia is 8 days before it. So the pagans had 8 days before the winter solstice, and they had a chag 8 days after the winter solstice. Okay, where did this come from? Tanu Rabbanan. There's now going a jump back into another Tanaitic source. And now we have to get a window into the rabbis' understanding of primal history. Right? And the rabbis had no problem thinking of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, whom we're about to meet in the story, as having lived, having been real, having been more than kind of fantastic archetypes, but having had real experiences whose remnants still impact us today. Now remember, Adam Harishon, the first human being, was born just a few days after the world was born. According to Jewish tradition, when in the calendar year is the world born? Rosh Hashanah. Hayom Harat Olam. Hayom, 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 Hayom Harat Olam. Today is the birthday of the world. Our tradition sees our people as having been born on Pesach. Our tradition sees the world as having been born on Rosh Hashanah. So the odometer of the world's history turns over Rosh Hashanah. So if the world was born on Rosh Hashanah, then Adam was born on the 6th of Tishrei, as it were, in the fall, in the season of the fall. So the Fisha Ra'a Adam Harishon, that the first person saw, Yom Shemit Ma'et V'holech. What happens? Imagine, whenever I read this text, I think of Tom Hanks in Castaway tracking the seasons on the wall of the cave. So imagine the first human being, and again, suspend factual disbelief for the moment and try to get into the emotions that we're going to ascribe to this person. He's born. He starts to get a sense of his world. He doesn't know anything about how the world operates, but he's taking track of time. And he's noticing that every day there's a little bit less light than there was, because from September 18th to September 20th to September 22nd to September 24th, the sun goes down a little bit earlier, and there is that much less amount of light. And no matter where you are in the world, right, the presence of the sun's light and the presence of the sun's warmth is something that you understand as being significant to living, to thriving. Amar, Adam said, Oily, oh my God, what am I going to do? This is terrible. Shema b'shvil shesarachti olam chashuch ba'adi. Maybe it's because of my sin. What sin? Having been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, having to live in a real world as opposed to in a perfected world. Maybe it's not only that I no longer live in the Garden of Eden, I live in a world that is dying. I live in a world that's getting darker and darker. And he's never yet lived through the full cycle, so he doesn't know that it's a cycle. All he notices is it's getting darker and darker and darker. V'chozer letohu v'vohu, very Genesisian. It's going to return to the exact thing it was before God pulled life out of chaos, void and nothingness. V'zohi mita, that's going to be my death. Sheniknasa an alai min hashemayim, that had been meted out from heaven for my not having followed God's instruction in the Garden of Eden. Amad, he got up, v'yashav chet yamim b'tanit. For 8 days he fasted, right? And you can imagine that he was getting really, really nervous when the days were getting really, really short, and he fasted for 8 days. I love the image. Primordial man, as a way of petitioning God to save him, engages in an act that eventually the Jew is going to raise up as the way that you show your humility and your penitence before God. Uva tefillah, it's added in, which may or may not be part of the original text. He fasts and he davens, please God, save me. Kevan shera'at kufat tevet, once, and here the Hebrew kufat tevet is the rabbinic word for the winter solstice. Once he saw the winter solstice had passed, v'ra'a yom shema'arich, he said, I think there's a little bit more light here than yesterday. I think December 23rd is slightly brighter than December 22nd. Amar, oh, I get it. Min hago shalolamhu. This is the way the world works. It ebbs and it flows. It gets darker and shorter, and eventually it's going to turn around and get lighter and longer. Asa shmona yamim tovim. He made a yantif. He counted for 8 days to make sure the pattern was continuing. L'shana ha'acheret, and the next year when it happened again, Asa'an le'elu ve'elu yamim tovim. He said, you know what? I'm going to have a holiday leading up to the winter solstice, remembering when I was fasting because I wasn't sure if it was going to go okay. That's kalenda. And, or is that, I forgot which is which. That is kalenda. That's Saturnalia. And kalenda, Yamim Tovim hu kav'am l'shem shemayim v'hem kav'um l'shem avodat kochavim. So Adam says, the next year I'm going to have 8 days of a holiday leading up, commemorating when I was fasting, asking for God's forgiveness. And then on the 8 days after the solstice, I'm going to have an 8-day party, a celebration, a bacchanalian feast of joy and of warmth and of light. And this is how the rabbis mention it without referring to Hanukkah, but there's a wink here, I believe, and most scholars believe. Hu kav'am l'shem shemayim. When Adam did it, he established it for God's glory, for the glory of the single God who created the universe. The Haim, and they, the idolaters, the pagans, the people who don't get it, the people who understand reality very differently than us, Haim kavum l'shem avodat kochavim. They established it for idolatrous purposes. Okay, what are the rabbis saying here? What might the rabbis be saying here? First, they're saying that originally the pagan holidays that we, meaning they, in their era, were experiencing amongst the non-Jews of the generation, they didn't begin with a pagan source. They began with Adam Harishon, the first creation. And they began in a response to a darkening world. But secondly, I believe what's going on underneath the surface is they're saying Hanukkah was preordained. Hanukkah is not only at its core the Maccabees and the Chashmonaim and oil and even and military victory, and it's not even only not by night, not by power, which is what we discussed about this morning. Hanukkah speaks to an earlier primal human urge. Adam Harishon put Hanukkah in motion. The story just filled in the blanks later. From before there was a temple, before there was David, before there was Moses, before there was Jacob, before there was Abraham, there were our ancestors recognizing that in the deepest dark of winter's night, we need to light a candle, celebrate the fact that the earth is going to heal itself and get warmer and lighter. And even though we know it's the case that our holiday of Hanukkah is based on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar, it's also the case that our lunar calendar is intercalated to make sure that it keeps matching up with the solar calendar. So it always happens that our Festival of Lights happens in December, right? If we lived on a fully lunar calendar, as the Muslims do, then Hanukkah would occasionally appear in February and occasionally appear in June and occasionally appear in August, and it would lose some of its connection. But something, even though the official halachic answer for why our calendar is intercalated to make sure that Pesach always happens during spring, one of the results of that is that our Festival of Lights, like the pagan Festival of Lights, like the Christian Festival of Lights, like the Kwanzaa Festival of Lights, is taking place during the time of the year when the human soul is most in need of oil that lasts longer. This, I believe, is the rabbis winking at Beit Shammai, saying, Beit Shammai, you might be onto something. Even though we're not going to light our Chanukiot the way you do, we get that you have reasons to be suspicious that the reason that our holiday is 8 days long has something just to do with that miracle of the oil. There's something earlier that is informing that link. Larry, Diane?
So having lived for so many years in the Southern Hemisphere, all of this logic doesn't work. And it's not because of the weather, but because it's not the winter solstice. It's a time when things are, the days are the longest. And I have to say that celebrating Hanukkah, but also some of the other holidays out of season is a very strange thing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Adam got it wrong because Hanukkah is the oily festival and Sukkot is the most minhagi festival.
Are you making an oil pun there, or is that unintentional?
No, I was making an oil pun.
Got it. Because if you weren't, I was going to suggest that you do. Perfect, right? So Diane, your kind of your conceptual discomfort with doing Hanukkah in the summer of wherever you are speaks to the rabbi's connection to this text, right? There's something about this holiday that has to be in winter's navel, right? And we're not the only one. Rabbi Schatz?
When we think about, I'm going to do the text at the bottom in a second so you can scroll all the way to the bottom. The part of this that is so interesting to me with the 8 days of the fasting and the 8 days of celebration is that in that text, when Rabbi Kligfeld mentioned how in Masechet Shabbat, it's like around 21 through 22 of Masechet Shabbat that we talk about the Hanukkah candles, the piece, and I wrote about this in Table of 5 if you want to read it this week, but the piece that talks about what we do on Hanukkah says all of these things happened, and then the next year they instituted Hanukkah. And before looking at this piece about Adam and Chava, I wondered, like, why the next year? You just had this amazing thing happen. Why not institute the holiday right then and there? Why not say Hallel and sing Al Hanisim and all of those things right in that moment when you're feeling it? Why wait an entire year? But there's something nicely connected to this piece about Adam and Chava, how you have to have perspective. You have to go through something to be able to actually say that was a miracle, or this was my learning so that I can do the Chag in its entirety in that next year. And so seeing this piece juxtaposed to the part of our tradition that we look to understand why and how we do Hanukkah is a very interesting, mirror one to the other. So we're going to end here talking a little bit about darkness and the light that is brought into the darkness. And because we're going to go into Hanukkah, into Havdalah, another H word, we are going to talk a little bit about this phrase, La Yehudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason Ve'ikar. We see this actually, as you can see on your page, we see this from Megillat Esther, right? That there is this moment where the Jews enjoy the light, the or, and the happiness, the gladness, it says here, simcha v'sason ve'ikar, because they are able to be who they want to be, go out into the world and celebrate the religion that feels comfortable to them, that is theirs to celebrate, that they have freedom of religion, they have freedom of expression, and that comes with a sense of light. And when we do Havdalah, we use this phrase to remind us, not just because it says the word light, but that we need to put that back into the world. That we need to bring that light, that freedom that not everybody has, even today in 2020, back into the world, to be able to shed light on the religious freedoms and the freedoms really of expression that we all deserve to have. And Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who we've quoted a lot because unfortunately we lost him all too soon, wrote a beautiful sentence that I want to leave us with before I pass it back over to Rabbi Klickfeld if he wants to have the last word. What he writes is, for though my faith is not yours and your faith is not mine, if we are each free to light our own flame, together we can banish some of the darkness of the world. So even if Hanukkah did not originate from just a place of Jews wanting to bring light into the world, what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks is teaching us is that it doesn't matter. And maybe it's even better that all of these different religions have ways of bringing light into the darkness. Because if we each bring that light into the darkness, then we have a brighter world, and a world that is full of many people wanting to see that darkness go away.
And we should continue to light our Chanukiot and celebrate our Jewish identity and our Jewish way of serving God and serving the world. And we should also look for opportunities in the present day and hints in the past, where the sages who bequeathed this beautiful particulars tradition to us also were looking for ways to connect, even back then, to universalist themes and to connect with all people who are trying to find light in the middle of darkness. We can do both simultaneously. We can reject the extremists who say that we have to jettison all things that keep us away from one another and simply merge into one undifferentiated melting pot. And we could reject those extremists who say we want nothing to do with people who are not like us. Okay? We can also identify with the human beings out there of all religious and cultural backgrounds who in the middle of December want to light a light in their homes and light a light in their hearts. And we can do so in our Jewish way and feel connected to the world population at the same time. And that is Pursuing Nisa. That is publicizing the miracle of being alive and being able to pull light out of dark. So we're now going to move into our candle lighting ceremony. Rabbi Schatz.
Should we do Havdalah first?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. If you want to follow along, you can. Rabbi Klickfeld, will you unshare your screen here? Great. If you want to follow along with Havdalah, it's on page 283 in the Lev Shalem. Let me just get all my stuff here. Yanai nanai nai nai yanai nanai nai yanai yanai nanai nai nai yanai nanai nai yanai nai nai yanai yanai nai nai yanai yanai nai הנה אל ישועתי, אפתח ולא אפחד, כי עוזי וזמרתיה, אדוני ויהי לי לישועה, ושבתם מים בששון, ממענה הישועה, לאדוני תחסלה, אדוני צבאות עמנו. משגב לנו, אלוהי יעקב סלה, אדוני צבאות, אשר ידע בוטח בך, אדוני יושיע, המלך יעננו ויום קוראנו ליהודים. הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועתך, ובשם אדוני אקרא, יין עיני עיני יין עיני עיני עיני. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מיני ושמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מירי האש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, המבדיל בין קודש לחול, בין אור לחושך, בין ישראל לעמים, בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול.
אמן. המבדיל בין קודש לחול, חטאותינו ימחו, זרענו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, וככוכבים בלילה. זרענו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, וככוכבים בלילה. אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו הנביא, אליהו הגלעדי, אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו הנביא, אליהו הגלעדי. במהרה יבוא אלינו עם משיח בן דוד, במהרה יבוא אלינו עם Mashiach ben David. Let's set up your Chanukiot for the third night. Rabbi Shatz, Bakasha.
I'm trying to find it so you can all follow along. I forget what page I said just a few moments ago that has it in the Lev Shalem. 429. Here we go.
And 242 in the Sim Shalom.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asa nisim la'avoteinu bayamim hahem b'zman hazeh. Hanerot halalu shanu madlikim, hanerot halalu shanu madlikim, al hanisim ve'al haniflaot ve'al hateshuot ve'al hamilchamot she'asita la'avoteinu, she'asita la'avoteinu bayamim hahem, bayamim hahem, bayamim hahem b'zman hazeh. Anything else you want to say?
I guess we could do Mao's tour one more time because some people were not when we sang it before. Mao's Osur Yeshuati Lechana Elishabeach Tikon Beit Tefilati Vesham Toda Nizabeach Le'et Tachin Matbeach Mitzor Hamnabeach Azegmor Beshir Mizmor Chanukah Tamizbeach Azegmor Beshir Mizmor Chanukah Hamizbeach. Rabbi Shash, you want to just announce the upcoming events that people can participate in this week, and then we'll wish everybody a Shavua Tov.
Sure. I also want to say how lovely it is to see family members flock together for candle lighting. It's really, really lovely to see your homes fill and your screens fill when we got to that point tonight. Tomorrow night we have the Hanukkah monologues, which will be wonderful as they are every year, and we look forward to seeing you there tomorrow night. For the rest of the week, there are programs happening for all different ages. Some stuff for ECC kids, some for young families, some for empty nesters. There's something for everybody. So just keep a look in your email and if you're on our Facebook group on Facebook to see what we have coming up this week. The last night of Hanukkah, Rabbi Kligfeld and I will be participating in a nationwide Hanukkah lighting that they are calling Illumination. Talking about puns there. And if you would like to join, it's not a interactive event, but it'll be something that you'll be able to see congregations, maybe actually not just communities, let's say communities, all over the country lighting the Hanukkah candles together. Rabbi Kligfeld will be offering a blessing from Temple Beth Am. So different communities will have different moments of participation, but it should be a lovely evening. Neshama Karlibach will be singing, and we hope that you will join us there. Anything else that I'm forgetting to highlight?
I don't think so. Shavua to everyone. Chag Urim Sameach. Happy Hanukkah. Go find and share the light amidst the darkness with fellow Jews and with fellow humans.
Amen. Shavua Tov.
Rabbi Kligfeld, look what was at our door after Shabbat.
Hold on, I don't see you.
Muted yourself. Look what. All we can see is the barcode, and it says 17th Street.
It's a box from J.C. Newman.
Then I'll see you on Tuesday night.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Hanukkah Sameach. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Chag Sameach, Shavua Tov. Thanks for having me.
Shavua Tov, Chag Urim Sameach.
And meeting for all. What? You are the host now? Someone made